Okay, good. So I'm going to begin my speech in three, two, and one. Mr. Speaker, I think it's very crucial for us to understand that this debate, or where this debate happens, is in very conservative society. I don't think it's conservative liberal society is already open to the idea that, oh, queer people exist and queer people should have rights. But secondly, most of these liberal societies, especially as we have them in status quo, are societies that already, or to a very large extent, have done away with like their mythological connection. So they have nothing to do with gods and gods per se. So you look like societies like the United States of America, societies like the UK, and it does not seem to be like they have any like mythological connection to any mythological god per se. But societies that are very conservative in nature, societies that exist in the African sphere, societies that exist in many Asian sphere, societies by that by virtue of their entire identity and connection have excluded queer people from being part of them because they view them as like vestiges of like a colonial era, vestiges of like a Western propaganda or Western identity. I think that this is where the societies, this debate happens. This is why it is very crucial for the LGBTQ community since they want to protect members of their group. This is why it is very crucial for them to take strategy as a priority to show that the members or people who are queer are not just people who are, acting basically from liberal ideology, but people who have some level of connection to the homeland, some level of connection to those beliefs and identities that they hold true. I think it's very crucial, especially this is the bit of they derive their rights from like abstract universal principles. They derive those rights from their sense of belonging with their lineage and their culture. The most effective weapon used by the state in these conservative societies to like suppress these people and their rights is that this action of them like being queer is like literally on like perhaps African or on Asian. So you would find in like the Western fair. It's just an American thing to do. It's not necessarily like an African thing. We in Africa, we don't do this particular thing. The problem with this label or of the action of being queer or the character of being queer in this particular
Right.
instance is because it strips that individual of their community protection. When the person is seen in this particular way as being like in this particular way, what happens is that they are no longer seen as people that should be protected within that particular community. In fact, very large extent, you can basically say that they are like an agent of cultural imperialism. And so you notice, and the reason why this is very true is because most of the defense for all of the law and all of these particular like like as a defense of traditional values against foreign influence. We have to protect our African heritage. We have to protect where we come from. All of these particular things. When the LGBTQ community decide to prioritize the use of this mythological like influence or whatever, what you do is that you are able to point back to the historical structure, like the historical narrative of those communities to say, no, these people are not should not be isolated from you because they are inherently a part of you. The gods that you want to support, the gods that you worship, or whatever, are people who were also like this. So it means at the end of the day, the justification for that has been pushed to support these particular laws against these queer people would really be reduced. But secondly, the social
POICO.
antipathy these particular people would also reduce in a very to a very large extent. I'll take you in a bit. The second thing that we have to talk about in our case is like is what we call like the psychological like need for this particular action. Note that in a conservative society, when people bring up this particular kind of idea, it becomes suspicious. So what it means is that when the LGBT community are trying to are trying to like proselytize within this conservative community to say, no, it is important for us to accept this particular kinds of people. What happens at the end of the day is that people become suspicious. They feel like you are coming to change them, to change their very nature. And then you have like strong people within this power structures within these particular communities who still also derive their power from the way that community is structured, say that this is something that should not happen simply because these people are trying to change our identity and change us in this particular way. What happens when these guys use this means to like prioritize the entire narrative? What happens is simply that these guys do not necessarily see this as a new idea, but as a restoration of an idea that was once lost. So it means that we have like this is something that was always normal or has been normal based on the fact that we are our gods or people that we always act in this particular. The idea is that you change the narrative from the imposition of a new idea or something that can be viewed as colonialist, like in terms of structure, to something to a concept where you are restoring like old values and you are ensuring that these guys are accepted within that particular community, not as people that are just accepted, but people who are
You, I
accepted.
see you.
You can point to their leaders to say, "Oh, this is something that existed like for a very long time." We think that this is very good because for these people within these particular communities, it protects them. I'm going to talk about that, how it does that. Let me take that POI.
Unlike universal principles such as human dignity and equal rights, these myths are not universal and are often debunked. Even within Greece, we've seen multiple iterations of Achilles and Patroclus. Why do you think that grounding it in these myths, which are oftentimes debunked and changed with different iterations, is a good idea, and how does that affect the longevity of the movement on your side?
I think in very large extent you just have to understand that even if there are multiple interpretations, I think every society has a particular way to which like they view these deities or a particular interpretation that they subscribe to. We think that to a very large extent this is just about playing that narrative particular interpretations of whatever happens in society. We don't think that this is going to like affect negatively the longevity of the movement because at the end of the day, when these guys are accepted within these particular communities, via the regard of the interpretation or the differences of interpretation that you want to talk about, we think at a very large extent is still going to ensure that these guys are protected. That is the objective of the LGBTQ movement at the end of the day, to ensure that these people's rights are respected within the communities that they claim to identify with. At the end of the day, what we do on our side of the house from side OG is that we delegitimize those structures that say, oh, this thing is un-African, it's not part of our societal belief. And then we accept them like basically because these are the people or these actions are already things that we can identify with culturally. We think that we protect these people and we create a community for them within their own particular community. We are very, very proud to propose.
Okay, fantastic. Leader of opposition ready for you, and you are.
Cool. What's up, guys? Am I audible and visible?
Yes, affirmative.
Thank you for acknowledging that. Hope everyone is well. Awesome tournament. My name is Joseph. No preferred pronouns. POI verbally. Say it once. I'll hear you and I'll take it. I'll do a countdown before I begin. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the subjectivity of literature, bound up in mysticism, open up the discussion of promoting queer rights and identity to the realm of literary discussion. This has room in a literature or history class, but is ultimately a terrible strategy for the movement to have to prioritize. This debate is specifically about what they need to be able to do, especially since in terms of resources, time, and human capacity, they are very limited. And given the intersectionality of the movement, given multiple strands, and in many instances, certain degrees of infighting, it's terrible and ultimately a problem-solution mismatch. A few key points of framing which I think are relevant to this debate that also serve as substantive material. Number one, this is an actor motion of the queer community, but we need to be able to look at this from the lens of the collective and as individual people. That is to say, institutional leaders or key opinion leaders in terms of being able to lock in on a strategy given the intersectionality that I mentioned in my pre-oration. There are 3 sub-points under this. A, people within the movement who we have to be able to take care of given the huge amount of diversity and in many instances a strong push from the conservative right and the radical left. These are the people who we need to be able to involve in discussions and not just delude this into the realm of literature and mysticism, something that both of these extremes might not even be privy to given that they might not be as religiously or culturally aware. B, people outside the movement, allies and other people we have to gain the support from in order to be able to lobby against structural reform. That is to say, legislative and economic barriers set up by politicians, set up by the patriarchy, and other conservative institutions who weaponize and use religion and not necessarily culture or history as a means to be able to lock in these queer people in their own despise. C. Closet queers and individuals or trans persons who are moderate and unsure about themselves who we want to be able to help. Number 2, what is the consequence of prioritizing these local myths and why is it a bad strategy? A. As what the POI suggests, and this is me co-opting it, this is largely bound up in regional myths and legend through literature, whether it be Greek, Norse, or of indigenous people. This ultimately is few and far between, and many people in itself are not aware about it. Maybe they heard it in class, but the way it manifests itself to be able to arrive at the conclusion of, oh bro, those guys, they were gay. Oh, that person, they were bi and they were trans. Even if these people are now aware of it, which is the case coming from the Prime Minister, it opens it up to a lot of discourse and reinterpretation, which ultimately make it a deadlock and up to the realms of literary subjectivity of who can write a longer and better term paper or who can give a better debate speech about it. That is to say, you're scrutinizing the wrong thing because ultimately it's like, wait, is that thing canon? No, bro, it's just some bullshit offshoot fan fiction, which is ultimately a terrible catch on to. The second part about this is that it's not necessarily a tipping point, especially when it comes to the plight of the queer community. That is to say, we need to be able to look at the very real plights of particular individuals to be able to understand if this is an appropriate or that is to say, we need to be able to lock in on these shithole conservative patriarchal people who do things like say, being gay is not okay. It is not legitimate. The state won't look at that. You cannot get a gender reconstruction kind of surgery. You cannot do PDA. Heterosexuality is the way to go. Number 3, and quite importantly, what is our comparative? What would we rather prioritize? And this is a round-winning case. We think we want to be able to prioritize the very visceral, legitimate, and grassroots stories of people who exist in the spectrum. Let's say you're a gay, homosexual man raised in a Catholic regime. You're a lesbian who was in the closet for far too long and are now in a liberal society wherein things work out in your side of the world so they can be able to learn the best and worst from each other's stories. We can even talk about the very people within transition, a huge part of the movement. Bisexual people who are looking at either becoming homosexual or even transitioning, for example, to potentially becoming trans. These are the very real stories we have to be able to listen to. And this debate is about, we can have a long tipping point to respond to the previous speaker is in terms of those things. The heart of is really the theme of really talking about what change we want. How do we best reach the interest of the particular movement in order to challenge these very real and valid limitations and on their comparative why it's a terrible kind of strategy even if people are aware? The first thing I have to say is that it undermines the progress you've already. There are conservative literary who are going to try to say not. And sure, even if the previous speaker responds, more perspectives are better. And they try to set this debate and say, bruh, it's only going to be in those like minorities and indigenous communities who we want to take part of. My question is, aware of things, why do we have to prioritize it even more? These minorities and indigenous communities are important. They are a legitimate strand. But if we want to have a true strategy that is able to encapsulate that intersectionality, we don't want to highlight those fringe differences, Mr. Speaker, and drown it in the realm of literary subjectivity. The harm is far too great and ultimately on their side of the house. Even if you're motivated to have this cultural protection, etc., then have a museum. Let's represent those taking away the attention from the and people don't accept literal figures in belief who are ultimately not necessarily even religious in nature, but ultimately a part of subjective norms of culture. And for all of these reasons, we think it's a terrible strategy. We are proud to stand on side negative. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. Deputy Prime Minister, ready for you when you are.
Okay, so am I audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. So I'll begin my speech in three, two, and one. Okay, so what opposition has attempted to do in this debate is to ground their cases in like a fear of the subjectivity that could come out of like adopting this approach. The problem here is that they do not understand the internal logic of how these conservative societies are structured. In conservative societies, there is no such thing as an objective fact that can exist outside of a cultural narrative. So it means that when you try to proselytize within these communities to talk about how it is very important to do this particular thing, if that thing is not viewed within the perspective of their culture, it cannot relate to it within the perspective of their culture. Oh, they're already aware. So why are they not accepting? You have to understand that within these societies, there are power structures that exist. These are the power structures that we need to delegitimize, right? These power structures essentially say that these things are un-African. And so they are the only way by which you can understand and interpret what it means to be that particular thing. The fact that these guys can basically, this elite can basically say, oh, this is what favors us, and then create that narrative and then structure society in that way. We think any form of inspiring of right to help people within that particular community. Note that even if you say that this approach is going to subject this like entire like the aim of the movement to like multiple interpretations, we think that that is good. Why? Because when a society is governed by like a rigid singular interpretation of tradition that excludes certain people, the goal of a movement in supporting the right of those people is which is necessary, but you do that by like creating a crisis of interpretation. We think that that is just essential in this way. So when you bring up all of these things to point out that this thing that you guys support or identify with is also identifies with these particular people that you are you are excluding. I think that it's going to help, like it's going to help people to then begin to relate with these guys, like these people that are excluding, like the queer guys. It's going to help them to relate with them on a much better access, because at least to a very large extent you can identify their behavior with people that you necessarily say you support or you worship, right? So it is not necessarily about whether the myth is true, but about who has the authority to explain it. We think that we need to delegitimize the authority systems within this particular community in order to ensure the rights of the people who the rights of queer people within this particular community. So the idea is this: you just have to prove that the existence of these people is valid because of the existence of certain divinities that you guys associate with. To that extent, we think that within this particular society, because this is basically social, you are going to have a lot of support for people in this particular particular way. But I think the next thing to talk about is how resource allocation and this thing will be done with this particular strategy. Because you have to note that most like the movement what will I call it, like branches, if that's correct, like movement branches within this particular conservative societies often find themselves financially starved. They have to rely on international grants, right? Because everybody within that society would not want to support. They don't care. They don't see these things as something vital because it does not identify with their reality. When you prioritize this strategy, what happens is that you tap into like the cultural capital that exists within this society. So you are going to have people within that particular society begin to explain to other people within that particular society that, oh, this thing might actually be true because we have people like this who are
Oh,
also like who believe in this particular way. In fact, this means that to a very large extent, that helps the movement. But secondly, within this particular movement, it is also very possible, and we think that it's much more likely on our side, that you are now going to have people within this particular society begin to raise a lot of funds to push it. The reason why we think that this is going to work, and the reason why we think that this is very important, especially within the scope of this, is because what it does is that it then begins to legitimize the actions of the movement in this particular way to find solvency for people who are for queer people within those communities. That legitimization comes from the fact that within that conservative society, you are having people who then support it. These
yeah,
guys are supporting it because they can then identify with the stories or the realities of these queer people. But thirdly, I think it's very important for us to understand how this strategy also dismantles like the power structures that exist within these conservative societies. Because note that most of these most of these societies, you just have like a one structure that tells us that, oh, this is what we should do, or this is how you should interpret yourself. This is gay, lesbian, queer people are people that you should that should exist outside. They are on African, they are on whatever, and all of these kind of things. When you prioritize this particular thing, what you do is that you take the narrative from these particular people. So you delegitimize the authority of those who would necessarily like use tradition to oppress and refuse to provide the rights of the rights of these people, like who refuse to make those rights legal. We think that to a very large extent, when this is the strategy that you take, what you do is that you're able to connect more with the people within that particular society. The problem that the people would have to deal with in this case is that it is not going to be an easy front where you can just say, oh, this particular thing does not apply to us. It is now going to be, we can identify with this thing within our culture. Why is it something that we should not accept? Why should we exclude them? Why should we push them out? I think basically on our side, it is because of this reason that change is much more better on our side, or much more achievable. Because change now would be relying on an internal structure that exists within those particular like conservative societies, because there is an identity like connection or relationship that exists. So change happens internally, not externally. The problem with external change is that these conservative societies are able to weaponize it and say, oh, it is a liberal action against them to subsume their sovereignty or their ability to actualize within society. When it happens internally, we think that is good. But also when it happens internally, we think that it protects the right of queer people better, because not only do you create a community that they can relate with, a community where their family accepts them, where their friends accept them, where their religious leaders accept them, where like their entire the entire community accept them. But secondly, they are also able to actualize within those particular communities. They don't have to escape to the United States to live their life. We think that it is just better on all of this regard. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to propose. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. DL, ready when you are.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you guys are on, you're good.
Thank you. I'll take one from Closing Government, if ever you guys have. Say it once through voice, and then I'll take it. I'll start in 3, 2, 1, and go. The LGBTQ plus community is not devoid and lacking of stories. They're not devoid of lacking of narratives and of information to push for queer representation and rights. The inherent problem with prioritizing local myths is that the trade-off of which stories you choose to deprioritize. You choose to ignore the stories of the people within these conservative societies who already don't have a voice and yet are real and are proximately interested by the LGBTQ plus movement to actually give them a voice. And we think that this is disgusting at the moment you choose to prioritize something that is inherently not real. Joseph was incredibly clear with this. OG doesn't respond, we take this point. I have 3 rebuttals towards opening government. Firstly, PM says that this debate happens in conservative societies like the ones that we see in Africa and Asia. Problem number 1, Asian and African states are not conservative because a myth from their culture 500 years ago is telling them to hate and be mad about queer people. They are conservative because of the experiences proximate to them and the realities that they can see and interact with. They don't like queer people because they don't understand them. And the myth is not going to make them understand these queer people anymore. Problem number two. How can you actually push for reformation and for formation of queer rights? Because the extent of government's argumentation is to say that local myths are important to these people. Okay, they're important, but what is the mech for all of these myths leading to real tangible change, e.g. the queer rights that is inherent in this motion? I will answer this question because it's pretty obvious that government cannot. It can't influence change for the sole reason that at best, government bench is unclear about the actual outcome that they want to achieve. They want a long-term impact that they cannot measure, nor can they understand when they succeed or when they don't succeed. I am saying this right now because this is the main way to weigh this debate. At their best, they can't answer when we should expect all of that change. The second thing I want to respond to. They say that they will protect the people that the LGBTQ plus people care
Right.
about. I say the exact opposite happens, and there's two reasons for this. The first reason is that you shift the discussion to something that is conceptual in nature. If you want to talk about myths, and if you want to prioritize myths as the LGBTQ plus community, then you literally are not calling out the current problems that conservatives are talking about right now. How do you get justice? How do you get better reform when instead of talking about gender inequality in Southeast Asia and the unfair expectations we have about women here, when you talk about a local
Right.
myth that at most 1,000 people know? But secondly, you literally give less voices of the people actually affected and actually live in this world right now. If these people are as disenfranchised and starving as the DPM says, then shouldn't we prioritize all of these people more instead of some literary figure that doesn't exist? Third response, side government presumes that the only way to actually change things is if you cater to the leaders of these conservative societies and that you change their minds. Like, this is a very reasonable understanding of their case, right? They want to change the minds of the people in power, yet at no point do they explain why they're incentivized to change to begin with. Look, we as the actor or the LGBTQ plus movement, you think they're going to listen to us? Probably not, right? Like currently, even with the current strategy that already does exist, it's not like they are like necessarily going to be super effective. It's far better that we take the offensive because at the very least we show that change can come externally as opposed to internally, which takes far too slow. Before I go on to my extension, I'll take the BOI.
Okay, so from OG, number one, you also on your side cannot measure when change would happen because it's going to be longer. It comes externally. But secondly, the idea from us is not to say we want to change the minds of the leaders of these communities. We are saying that we want to ensure that the people within this particular community are able to understand their queer people at a very human level where they can create those communities for themselves.
I mean, if you want to do that, why can't you just share the story of an actual living, breathing human person as opposed to a myth, right? Like, it's far more proximate for me to care about a person that I can see, that I can interact with, that I can literally know exists on this planet, as opposed to this literary figure. Again, extension. I'm going to talk about the comparative and why it's going to be better on our side of the house. To be clear, opening opposition's comparative is to not prioritize local myths, and to prioritize local people within these conservative societies that are LGBTQ plus people. I'll also tackle the first point made by government or by OG in saying that we can have a more reasonable metric at actually getting at change. Why is this comparatively better on our side of the house? Firstly, you just provide a framework for how to actually influence policy. Like, look, if you want queer rights, it starts at the point in which you define problem. This is where Joseph's analysis gets placed in, right? Because when you get to hear these stories of individual local people, you get to establish patterns. When these specific patterns emerge, you can look at it in terms of a narrative or at least in terms of data that you can actually provide different connections to. When you can extract data from it, that is how policy formations happen, and that is how the LGBTQ plus community can actually strive for all of these rights that don't currently exist right now. On the comparative, at most what you get from all of these local myths are what other people think about it. I think my timer is wrong. Just tell me when it's 7, okay? Secondly, you get better connectivity on the localized people who already don't get their stories told. Because let's be clear, funding is not something any team in this specific round can reasonably win on. Like DPM saying that you can capitalize on cultural capital, I don't think necessarily is going to be something that's important in this round because no one on this earth visited the Philippines, for example, because of a local myth that they heard about gender fluidity. So let's be clear on this metric, right? The metric and the most important thing in this debate is in actually getting all of the stories from all of the current LGBTQ plus people already currently living within these conservative states. As a consequence of them living and breathing, we probably need to prioritize and focus more on their own experiences, especially since their localized community is probably not like it's either A, very apprehensive towards them, but B, literally doesn't have a chance to get to know are like, what how they think and where their experiences are. So our comparison term change is just short term going to be more fulfilling for all of these people that actually had but now, in order to make sure that they at the very least are comforted within this specific fact. How does opening opposition win over all of these things or out of very clear how in regards to effective outcome, we're just far more concrete. Like literally, you can see our impacts more in comparison to the impact. But secondly, I think we're not that reliant on people actually changing their minds. Insofar as outcome independent of anything that happens, we can at the very least it's empathy towards another human being. It's just something that necessarily we can do on our own. For all of those reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
Awesome. Okay, time's up. We will call the member of government to start the case for CG. So Grillo, you can just like do what you're gonna do for closing that.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, I didn't know I was going to do that. Okay, so just give me a minute, please. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the biggest problem with opening government's case is not necessarily in terms of their framing, but in terms of how change occurs. I don't think opening government was able to prove change occurs because truly change would occur. I think in relating to the arguments that came from like opening opposition, I think we can agree to a very large extent that opening government would win opening up. The reason why that is true is because I think there is a substantial misunderstanding of government case from opening opposition, right? But let me just move to why I think change is going to occur. Because you have to understand that within conservative societies, right, the way change happens is on like it's three things. One, that people within that particular society, right, must there must be like some level of cognitive dissonance that happens in the sense that they have to begin to question those truths that they consider fundamental. But secondly, within these particular societies, as opening government has already told you, there need to be that cognitive dissonance must lead to like some level of erosion of that foreign like narrative to say that these people or the accept foreign narrative into our own culture. To a very large extent, this has to happen. But thirdly, right, an institutional co-option like of these particular people. So this would reflect in how policies are made, how policies are driven within these particular communities. On the first metric of change, we think to a very large extent that when you introduce or you particularly use these mythologies like to drive why people should be accepted within this particular community, and I think this is very crucial because the idea here is not to focus on like the gods and say, oh, the gods are in this particular way as open opposition wants you to believe. The idea here is simply to say that if the gods were able to, express themselves in this particular way, and you can find this particular character trait within this particular god, then it makes sense that you should also accept people within society who are human, like that, and also express this particular character trait. It makes no sense to exclude these particular people. The reason why this is very crucial is because when open opposition says you have to use real life stories, note that the real life stories of people who, number one, live within this particular community are already very subsumed. They cannot come out to talk about it because there is just one fundamental truth. If they come out, they are really oppressed. But secondly, those people who are able to live their lives have to leave these conservative societies to go abroad, to stay perhaps in liberal societies. It means that to a very large extent, their stories do not even get down there. But even if they were to get down there, these leaders within these particular communities are going to laugh at them. What happens with this mythology is simply that you are able to relate these guys with this is like this structure, like this mythological structure that they believe in. And the reason why it will work is because these guys believe in it. It's simple. Like their entire life structure are driven by those things. They believe in this, they worship them. So when they are religious leaders or when those becomes, you have to question, oh, this person has said this, this power structures or leaders are saying this, but this is what I can see. That level of cognitive dissonance we think is very crucial. But that level of cognitive dissonance would also change the narrative. It cannot be about, oh, it is a foreign identity, foreign idea. It's now something that we can also relate to within the scriptures that we can relate to it within the gods that we worship. We think that that is very essential. But thirdly, in terms of institutional corruption, when that happens, what it creates is that it becomes difficult for people to then begin to like objectively exclude people who present themselves as such. So what it means is that within that particular society, where otherwise they would have been angry, people are forced to question their conscience to see whether it is really true that they are doing the will of like the gods, or they are really doing what their identity or their cultural identity requires them to do. We think to the very extent where that cognitive dissonance exists, you begin to create some level of community within this particular. This is how OG's cultural capital things works, because you begin to create some level of space where these guys can feel comfortable. But secondly, we think to the extent where you are able to champion this narrative to a very large extent, what you do is that you change the social structure, because people within that particular community begin to question certain things. This is something that leaders within these particular societies don't want. At the end of the day, it is much more likely that you are going to create policy shifts within this particular community to begin to accept this particular kind of people, because to a very large extent, like the society, it becomes an internal thing. The reason why an internal agenda is really better than external is one, it is because it is driven by the people in these particular societies. But two, when you talk about external agenda for change, what it is most likely interpreted as is like it is a foreign action to like continue to subsume our culture. We don't think that this is very good. We don't think that this is I think that our society is what you do. Before I continue, just take that POI.
Side of your that this is right, but more likely people are going to be at a standstill.
There is no like counter belief. So what people would do, if I hurt somebody who identifies as queer, I am happy. People around me will congratulate me and say that I have done something. In our world, you create a conscience problem. I cannot hurt this person because I believe perhaps Songo is a god who is somebody who also expresses this, especially if the movement has already pushed for that particular kind of interpretation. It means that to a very extent where I can question my conscience to hold on to the fact that, oh, is this thing going right? A very large extent is a win for the vulnerable people within this community, because then it means that they might now begin to be viewed as human beings, not just interpreted as queer people society. But to a very large extent, this action just protects these guys. The action of creating community protects the vulnerable people within this particular society. Because otherwise, in your world, to be very comparative, they have no hope. They have to wait. Change is faster on our side, but it is more solid. It would last longer than change that will happen on your side, because change on our side is internal. The PM, the policy ensure that these guys have community. On your word, that's not happening. They see it as incursion. They will not accept it. We are very, very proud to propose. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Member of opposition ready for you when you are.
Am I clearly audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, starting my speech in the reverse count of 3, 2, and 1. Why does LGBTQ people actually, on what basis do they deserve the to all ages and human dignity? It is social movement is something that functions on the basis of universal principles that are non-negotiable, that are uncompromisable, and that do not hinge or depend on the basis of cultural acceptability or cultural acceptability or subjective interpretation of other people. We believe that rights of people are not up for discussion, perception, subjectivity, and compromisation. Rather, it should be based on the universal principles that are non-negotiable and uncompromisable, because just by the lottery of birth, just by the boon of being born, and just by their existence as a human, LGBTQ people deserve the right to do everything autonomously that they deserve. So when you actually shift away their the basis of their right from this universal non-negotiable something that is negotiable and interpretable, you actually harm the movement in the longer run, and not only that, you actually harm the identity and the source of unity of the LGBTQ people themselves. Now look, the universal principles have legitimacy and acceptance across multiple legal facets, political facets, globally accepted and accepted among all the sectors of the society. When you tell that it is my principle of freedom or it is my right to choose, these things cannot be contested, these things cannot be questioned or reinterpreted, because yes, when you talk about your freedom of expression and your freedom of the right to choose your own partner, these are inherently something that you possess. So when you actually question the rights of freedom of the LGBTQ people, you question the rights of freedom of the heterosexual people at the same time. And as a result, since your movement is grounded on human rights of all people, when some people are trying to on which their society is upright. So in our society, on the basis of universal rights, people actually have better merit and better ground for negotiation for their rights. Now, what is the problem with side opening opposition's case? Side opening opposition comes up and tell you that we will prioritize the story of the grassroots people. Very attractive on paper or on face value, but it is actually harmful in the long term. Why is that? Grassroots stories suffer from the same kind of problem that opening opposition actually criticizes the government case for. Grassroots stories are also up for perception and interpretation. You can come and tell the struggle of the LGBTQ people all you want, but heterosexual people might not just prioritize it because, well, it doesn't sound that bad. Well, that happens in my life too. Well, I suffer from the same in some degree. So, okay, LGBTQ people does not have it that bad. Secondly, it also actually puts your rights for negotiation where you submit your power, what kind of rights you want, to the right wing or the majority of the conservative people. Country Bangladesh, when I talk about my struggle as a woman, what has resulted in making this the basis for my movement is the grassroots conservative men actually negotiating and deciding what kind of rights are justifiable for me and what kind of rights are not justifiable for me. To my lack of safety, then yes, this is actually a very big problem you're going through. So stop coming out of your home and stay very obedient to the male counterparts of your life. So in this way, when LGBTQ people come up from their stories in the grassroots, it will be the majority of the society of heterosexual and conservative people who will get to decide how to solve their problem and how much of their right is justified and how much of their right is an excess that they should not have. And they get to decide when you are demanding too much. But when you base your movement on the principle of equal rights and universal principles, these conservative people or the majority of the society cannot come up and tell you that come up and tell you, okay, you are demanding too much rights and we don't actually need it. Secondly, this basing your movement on the basis of the stories of suffering is actually very disrespectful to your human dignity. We don't want pity, we want human dignity and we want our equal rights. When you come up with this and retell this story of sufferings again and again and again, people start pitying you. They do not respect you, and most importantly, you lost your respect to yourself. So basing your movement on the basis of pity on the basis of suffering is something that is very harmful on the O side of the case. Now, secondly, when opening opposition comes up and tells you that we are going to prioritize the grassroots people, it also suffers from a problem of intersectionality. Because lesbian people has debated for multiple times that their stories are not being brought forward in the LGBTQ community. So when you actually bring out the stories of the grassroots people themselves, the people who are privileged within the hierarchy of the LGBTQ community, only their stories are going to be identified as the and become the actually identifying characteristic of the LGBTQ community themselves. And therefore, the people, for example, the people who are agender people or people who identify as demi-romantic or people who identify as not the so much popular things, when their stories get deprioritized, they are likely to feel alienated from the community that they belong to itself, which so they are not going to get any support from their conservative heterosexual community, and then they are not going to get feel alienated from their own LGBTQ community themselves, which is very harmful in the longer run. So now, what does site CO provide you? We tell you that by doing so, you actually change the validation metric of the movement in long term. When you base your legitimacy and your source of validation in cultural norms and things that are subjective, you by changing this movement of validation, you put your rights up for negotiation. You actually come up away from the universal rights and equal rights, and this actually reflects a lack of trust and belief in the cause itself. Secondly, you seclude these myths are very much local and secluded. So you actually create a regional umbrella which erodes you from the globalized solidarity of the movement. Now, thirdly, at present, in the status quo, people are moving away from myths and historical myths and religious myths itself to actually rational principal rights. So when this kind of myths actually do not provide you with the solid grounding. When you anchor your movement on a myth that can be reframed, reinterpreted, and deprioritized, your movement can also get deprioritized. Lastly, it actually causes an identity shift in the LGBTQ community in themselves. The LGBTQ community right now demands their rights on the basis that they deserve equal human dignity as functioning and equal member of the society. But then they are going to base their identity on being mystical, symbolic, and exceptional, which is a cultural identity. Now, lastly, many myths are heteronormative. For example, Loki is associated with mischief. When you talk about Ardheshwari, here the Shiv represents that masculine people should always be aggressive and the feminine people should always be caring and nurturing, that cosmic aggression requires cosmic nurturing. And on the other hand, in many interpretations, Achilles and Patroclus are not actually gay to believe it, and therefore culture of the myths actually erodes the very basis or narrative shifting that your movement is based on. That is why SEO should win this debate. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, member Colin Gavweb, to run the Gav bench for us.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah, you're
Am
audible.
I? Thank you very much. Um, what were you saying? Okay, so I'm going to begin in three, two, one. Relate or they refuse to negotiate with the practical realities of conservative societies, how conservative societies are structured, and why that is very important, right? Because when CEO tells you that, oh, we should hold on to universal principles, principles that are globally accepted and all of those kind of things, principles that are accepted generally and in with conservative societies is that these principles are actually contestable. In these types of conservative societies, the state holds identify with that particular state have submitted their rights such that the state can decide when to take it and when not to take it, and there will be no there will be no way by which you hold on to the society. That in these societies, universal principles are contested. Like when you the state can literally cite whatever you want to do and call would not necessarily matter at the end of the day. The reason why this is very crucial within the scope of today's debate is because since if you advocate for unity already inherently contested within this particular state, what you do is that you continue to isolate where people identify as square within these particular societies. It means that for a very long time, you are not going to provide them with any form of solvency because the state is always going to continue to kick against them. There is always going to be backlash against them, and we think that that is problematic to these particular kinds of people. Secondly, they tell you that, oh, they want a situation where you can is that our side rights are like negotiable and all of those kind of particular kind of things. The problem with that, because what they want is a have dignity to exist and do all of those particular things, especially when they talk about how rights should not be negotiated. The problem with their side is that when these people, let's even agree that, oh, these universal rights are given to these people, this and even if it's given to these people. The problem is that within these particular societies where that change is not internal or did not come from an internal resolve to change, what are going, so yes, you can respect them, but they are not part of any community. We think kind of dignity come use if you really belong because these people offers you that level of camaraderie, like camaraderie, right? You are able to like express yourself. Your family understands you and accepts you. Your community understands you and accepts you. You are not excluded from your religious community. We think that because that change is internal in nature, we think that it is very crucial. It is very good for these people. At least on the worst side, on our side, what happens is that people are not queer people anymore. They are still going to understand them. On their side, this thing is going to be rigid. These guys are going to continually face fear. These guys are going to have to continue to stay in the cupboard or in the wardrobe or whatever. And these guys are not going to see any solvency. On our side, in the best case scenario, they get the community. In the worst case scenario, they are at least not going to be hurt or backlash because of that cognitive dissonance that we proved from side CG. Let me talk about like opening opposition, right? Because what opening opposition tries to argue basically is the subjectivity that is ascribed to this particular action. The reason why, I think we've done a lot of work to prove why this is not something that exists, but the reason why that subjectivity is not necessarily true is because number one, we think that when subjectivity is introduced into the entire like discourse, again, what happens is that you also begin to change or you begin to attack the singular narrative that exists within these particular communities. What happens at the end of the day is that you begin to borrow their word or their language. You begin to confuse the people that exist within this society. It means that at the end of the day, you begin to create structures that then will begin to support or advocate for the rights of these people simply because within those particular societies they can identify with this myth, they can identify with this particular thing because these myths do not exist in abstraction within this conservative society. They exist, think about, worship them, they move like vectors, they relate to them on a very minuscule level. We think that to a very large extent, this is very good for this particular kind of thing. But secondly, we think that the discourse is just better on our side because on our side, we are going to have that discourse, number one, happen internally, but happen rapidly. On the other side, you are going to have an entire community fighting against this incursion and saying that, oh, we don't want it. What it looks like is that it now looks as though it is the entire African society or this thing that is basically saying we don't want this particular thing. In our side, that divide extends outward. Like, so people within the community are saying that no, that are really discussing and are saying that, oh, we can't accept it, we should accept it, we should not accept it. To the very extent where this kind of discourse analysis happens, we think that it is good for the queer people because not only are their rights being discussed and the fact that the community is really taking note of them, but secondly, we think that their chance at having community and having their dignity is protected within this regard. What OO said is that, oh, we should focus on real people and all of those kind of things. But seriously, if you doctor this of that community looks at these guys as an anomaly. For example, in Nigeria, a lot of somebody was they just see it as an anomaly. In the instance where our reality can be tied down, and Nigeria is not really that conservative, by the way, but in the instance where if you take a conservative society and that reality can be tied down to something they really believe in, we think that it is very good for these people. It provides some level of legitimacy. We have already shown you how change would occur. The reason why we are far better than opening government is simply because we are able to prove to you how change this says is to prove how this happens in conservative society, change will occur of this thing. But we think that from Science DG, we're able to provide to you the mechanism that change will occur. We told you that it starts from that cognitive dissonance that exists. That cognitive dissonance leads to a rejection of this idea as a where I co-op some certain level of protection for these particular people. It looks like these guys having a community unity. This change is internal, so it means that it is going to last longer. But on our side, change is even going to happen faster. It is not going to happen faster on their side. It's going to be more problematic because people see these things as a foreign incursion into their culture, right? But on our side, change is much more likely to happen faster because people then begin to accept the reality that it is very possible that we also have this kind of trait. It is in everybody, and these people are normal. So it means that on our side, these guys are not excluded. These guys are protected. These guys can actualize. Their dignity is protected because they have a community. We are very, very proud to propose.
Okay, fantastic. Calling the up-web to end the debate first. Debaters are encouraged to take POIs.
Am I clearly audible?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, as you can see, my teammate is absent, so I'll be Aaron personing and starting my speech in the reverse count of 3, 2, 1. The whole government bench's case falls face first because their entire case tell these people something that is relatable with my culture when I say them that yes, LGBTQ ideals or narratives has existed in my socio-cultural elements as well. They're going to relate to me. They are going to not stigmatize me as much because now I'm a part of their culture, and therefore there suddenly is going to be very much caring about my rights. They're going to deconstruct power and going to bring change. It sounds very good in theory, but in reality this actually doesn't work like that. Opening government had got something right, that is culture is very sacred to people. So when you are actually advocating for your rights on the basis of universal human rights, for example, your right to love, your right to choose your own partners, and your right to live autonomously as you please, these rights cannot be contested, and these rights actually have a legal recognition which provides you with a better ground for advocacy. But what happens inside government's case world? In government's case world, when you come up and try to provide we already used to see you in suspicion that okay, these people are doing something that is out of my culture. But now when you come and try to base movement on the interpretation culture, they say that well, these people are attacking the very framing and the very existence of my culture. They come and think because this in the conservative societies, the most popular interpretation of Greek mythology is still that Patroclus and Achilles are actually best friends. They are not lovers. So when you come up and tell them well, they are lovers, they think that they are trying to reframe my very mythology. The Hindu people, they think that masculine people should be always the aggressor, and the Parvati is actually the feminine part aggression. Now when you try and compare that to non-binary people, they think that you are actually being very disrespectful to their god Shiva and Parvati, because Shiva and Parvati were not LGBTQ. They are separately masculine, separately feminine, who only came together to balance cosmic aggression with cosmic nurturing. Saying that masculinity should be aggressive and femininity should be always nurturing is disrespectful on another level, but we will not talk about that. But how the Hindu people are going to interpret it is as LGBTQ people are now attacking the very frame of their religion. They are trying to reframe and reinterpret their religion in a way that is abhorrent to their culture. Now Loki in the info series also tells about Loki trying to actually associate your movement with this kind of interpretations that are not popularly accepted, that are goes against everything others believe in. to provide you backlash with more aggression. Before, when you were advocating for your rights on the basis of universal human rights, there would be moderate religious people who could sympathize with your cause. Well, these people just want to live like themselves and does not want us to interfere with their lives. Okay, let's get have them. But when you go to the same moderately religious sympathizing people, actually very LGBTQ friendly, you had interpreted it wrong. Shiva and Parvati are actually represents the non-binary people. They are going to feel very disrespected and tell that, well, these people are attacking the very fabric and the very sources of my culture. They're trying to reframe it. So no, I do not want them to come and change. And secondly, culture is very and also very sacred to the conservative people and the right-wing people who hold all kinds of power. So they are going to now come down on you with all their might and try to alienate you from your society, bring movements that you are trying to attack the religious rights, and in this way alienate you further and stigmatize you further from society. And might even the religious equality will put the LGBTQ people in jeopardy in their side of the case. So the government side of the case actually does not exist because they never provide us with the likelihood analysis of why, when they come up and give a alternative cultural interpretation of their existing or suddenly very easy to wear. And because this likelihood analysis is comes to play out in real world. In the real world, it is likely to play out in the way that side CEO tells you, because that is more likely in the scenario. Now, the side government also actually losses out on this debate because they do not engage with any kind of thing that side CEO provides you. We have told you that how changing the validation metric itself in the long term actually harms your movement. We have told you that how by doing so you actually lost the globalized solidarity by fragmenting the movement into regional blocks, because these myths are very much regional. Now see, we have talked about, now let's judge on the metrics of the longevity of the movement. Now look, we have already proven that myth can be debunked and myth can be reframed in different ways. So when these myths are debunked or when these myths are reframed in different ways, your entire movement for the LGBTQ rights actually falls away. Secondly, Site CEO has already said in the member speech that people in the status quo are gradually moving away from any kind of historical and religious myths and are prioritizing modern ideals, modern days. This is more true because of the technological advancement and industrial revolution, where educated people do not take myths as something that they should be strictly abide by, but are actually day by day subscribing to modern rules. So it's on in this status quo, when you actually base your whole movement on something that can be reinterpreted, it actually puts the longevity of the very movement and the basis of the very movement in threat. Now, secondly, we have also talked about the identity of the LGBTQ people. Their identity in the government side of the world becomes more localized and they lost the global umbrella. Then their perspective also changes from wanting their rights on the basis of human dignity to wanting their rights because they are something exceptional, something very much mystical. Their identity becomes more ambiguous. Their understanding of self changes, and which in turn actually erodes the kind of unity that the LGBTQ community right now holds. Now, look, now let's move on to the metric of social change and where these people are more likely to get their rights. Now, they talk about deconstructing powerful hierarchies. Hierarchies are political and legal. So in order to deconstruct hierarchies, you have to speak to them in a political and legal language, which is the basis of the human rights. Where is the likelihood of change more likely, and where the people are supposed to get their rights faster? Rather than engaging, basing our entire movement on the basis of pity or sufferings, we have already talked about what are the problems with OSKs in the member speech. This actually makes the changes things very subjective. But on the other hand, when you speak solid language of legal rights and a solid language of moral principles that are recognized by this state, then it becomes hard to actually deconstruct your advocacy movement. And secondly, in governments and oversight of the world, we don't actually know what kind of rights we are asking for, but in CEO side of the world, these rights are very specific and therefore the rate of change is faster. Thank you very much. CEO should win this debate.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Upwip, for that speech. I will just like quickly get on with entering the rankings on the tab, and then I'll get back to you guys shortly. So please stay here, just like 4 minutes or maybe 5 minutes. I'll get back to you with Oy.
So much for the round.
To debate when the government bench